The Life Sciences DNA podcast is sponsored by Agilicium Labs, a collaborative space where Agilicium works with its clients to co-develop and incubate POCs, products, and solutions. To learn how Agilicium Labs can use the power of its generative AI for life sciences analytics, visit them at labs.agilicium.com. Sri, we've got Dennis Salotti on the show today. Who is Dennis?
Dennis is the Executive Director and Head of Clinical Outsourcing and Innovation at Jazz Pharmaceuticals. He spent over 2 decades deep in the operational side of drug development. His background spans clinical research, e-clinical technology, CRO and vendor management. He's becoming one of the go-to voices on how sponsors should think about selecting, qualifying, and partnering with vendors to run complex global trials. What makes Dennis special, he doesn't look at innovation as a shiny tool. He looks at how process, technology, and partnerships come together to improve trial quality, speed, and ultimately the experience of patients and sites.
For listeners not familiar with Jazz, what is Jazz Pharmaceuticals?
Jazz is a biopharmaceutical company that focuses on serious, often underserved conditions with a particular emphasis on neuroscience and oncology. We're known for bringing forward medicines in areas like sleep disorders, difficult to treat epilepsies, and a range of hematology and solid tumor cancers, and for continuing to invest in new therapies where there's a lot of unmet medical need. From an R&D perspective, Jazz runs complex global trials, increasing learning from data, digital tools, and AI to better run their studies, collect smarter endpoints, and make participation more feasible and easier for both patients and investigative sites.
What are you helping to learn from Dennis today?
As I mentioned, Dennis is a very practical and pragmatic leader. What he brings is a very thoughtful approach to how AI can be implemented and deployed across various different use cases. And Dennis, having the experience both in the clinical technology side and the vendor management side and the procurement side, brings a unique perspective around how not just technology can be used for technology's sake, but how do you implement it and make value and ROI for the organization.
Well, before we begin, I want to remind our audience that they can stay up on the latest episodes of Life Sciences DNA by hitting the subscribe button. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to hit the like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to listen to us on the go by downloading an audio-only version of the show from your preferred podcast platform. With that, let's welcome Dennis to the show.
Hi, Dennis. Welcome to Life Sciences DNA podcast. Really excited to have you here. It'll be great to kind of get your perspectives on your journey and what got you to Jazz. So love to hear a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Sri, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So, what brought me to Jazz was essentially a desire to get closer to making of medicines. I spent a number of years in consultancies and in other different roles, running technology companies, and in other capacities on the service side of the business. And I found that I just wanted to get back to what brought me into the industry initially, and that was really, being close to the making of medicines and playing my role and trying to bring those forward to patients that need them. Been about a 6-year journey since then, and it's been wonderful.
Wonderful. Dennis, as you came to your calling in terms of medicine, you must have seen the impact of technology and digitization over the last 6 years evolved. Share with me your journey and what you're seeing and how that landscape has evolved and how that's evolved with the role and job you play.
So it's interesting how much has changed across the last 6 years. Now, I came from a prior positions working in the e-cola, e-pro space and looking at watching technology evolve there, just seeing, consumer grade technology move into the research space and just how the user experience for patients and their caregivers had changed with the different modalities that we saw evolve there. Coming into Jazz over the last 6 years, we're observing how we've utilized some of the evolution of technology, particularly AI and other predictive analytic type technologies. Just it's been really exciting to see how we can take things that were traditionally done in a very labor intensive manual way to develop insights, and how technology has really shrunk the amount of time from from research to insight and really putting that insight into action in the trials. That's been the most exciting part of the journey I've observed.
And that's fantastic because that's kind of the use case we want to kind of explore. So, why don't you pick a area where there was research done human-wise and what kind of insights were discerned before, and then how you've now evolved with AI from that insights to action? Can you pick one or two areas which we could talk through?
I'll pick a couple areas, and I'm gonna warn you, Sri. These are potentially boring areas, but I think that's where you find the greatest opportunities to apply technology. I'll pick one that's near and dear to my heart, being in a sourcing role at Jazz, and and overseeing this like contracting function as well. When we go out, we engage with investigators. One of the things we seek to secure a contract is a critical path step to bringing a trial and trial access to patients. One of the steps that has to happen there is you have to negotiate a contract, you have to negotiate a budget. There is a necessary business relationship with those investigative sites. And the idea is you want to shrink that space, right? That time you're spent doing those administrative items to really get into the research. And it's not an exciting area. Negotiate. I'm not going to, even though it's a function I lead, I'm not going to, say that it's always exciting or that it's always, so that people look forward to doing. Um, but in seeking really, how do we expedite that? How do we shrink that space so that we can get the innovations into the clinics and get the trials running and the access to patients? One of the things I've observed technology, being able to do is take that manual process of reviewing past contracts, reviewing past history, reviewing sort of what the budget structures and the last negotiated budgets look like, and being able to ingest that as a corpus of knowledge and analyze that and summarize that very quickly for someone so that the starting point when we go to engage with an investigator, say, hey, we'd like you to participate in this trial, we're coming to them with something that's much more aligned to our past interactions. If we've had a past history with them, we're coming to them with something that is, that gets both parties a lot closer to saying yes, right? And being able to do the important work. And I think from a customer experience standpoint, that brings a much more positive experience for the investigator and their staff, which right now, post COVID, we know the constraints that are on sites. We know the burden, that's on sites. If we can alleviate a little bit of that and present a little bit more of a delightful experience in an otherwise probably not exciting area, that delivers something different. I think that differentiates us, as a sponsor, but also for the industry as a whole, it achieves the goal of really just, lightening the burden on the sites and bringing, trial access to more patients. And so that's been a really exciting development in a relatively unexciting space.
No, it is an exciting space because what you have done is take structured information from unstructured documents, which are past contracts, and then creating a structured infrastructure for you to then make a determination on what could be the contract values. Let's deep dive a little bit more. So was there any particular tool you used? Was it an LLM? Any particular aspects which you used in that journey to take structured information from unstructured data and then collate that together?
It's the collation of multiple projects, and I'll be honest, they're at different stages of their life cycle right now. So we are working with partners in those different areas with different solutions. They are LLMs. That's the underlying technology behind it. But one of the things we're looking at is agentic interfaces for those LLMs, so that you could have a very conversational. You could ask questions in the way that an end user, a contract negotiator, may want to ask the questions, thinking about how do they prepare to engage with the clinical site. So that's how we approach it. I will say it took. In order to do that, one of the learnings I had was how much you have to think about your content and think about your underlying process and think about how you want to approach that problem so that you can appropriately engage with your partners to train the model, further train the models or tune the models, further shape the way the agentic experience occurs.
Is this the user communities, your internal teams who are using it, or are you rolling it out to other external stakeholders within the organization?
So no, right now we work cross-functionally. So there's a couple of functions that engage in this activity, but it's predominantly an internal user base. So we're working in a closed system with our, within our content and with our users. So it's a fairly, well, I'll say controlled experiment that way. And we were careful in that the scope of it and the use case was very narrow in that, so that we could demonstrate success and then expand from there. That was a deliberate choice in the beginning of this. So if you think about how this process works, we segmented out sort of the contract negotiation, where, to your point, there's a lot of unstructured data, in a document, in a PDF, and then we separated that out from a separate initiative, a separate AI initiative around the budget analysis and the budget information, where it's a little bit more structured. It's in a grid. It's in a different format. And to your question around the different user groups, there's different stakeholders that engage in both of those activities. And so by segmenting it out that way, we were able to engage deeply with the end users in different use cases, and in some cases, very different user groups.
And clearly the ROI, as you said, is the site experience and the speed in which you're doing site contracts. Are you doing a before and after? What was the before contracting time and experience? And then what is it after? And are these quantitative or qualitative metrics you're collecting?
Yeah. So we have quantitative, we do some benchmarking with some external groups against industry, and then we have our own internal benchmark. So we do measure cycle time. We measure a couple different KPIs around this. So it's your typical cycle time. How many days does it take, right, to negotiate a contract? That's the most intuitive one. But we also look at how many, what we call turns of the document or rounds of negotiations. How many times does a document or a contract or a budget go to a clinical site and leave our hands and then come back to us? We found that when we analyze our data, that is a correlative, sometimes predictive measure of how long a negotiation is going to take. The more turns of the document correlates with the length of time you're going to ultimately negotiate. So the idea is, if you can reduce the number of times you have to exchange, you can reduce the overall cycle time. And then we measure the cycle time, obviously, as the outcome. I can't speak to the after yet because we're in the middle of it. I think it's a little bit too premature to describe what the cycle time reduction is, but I can share what our goals are around it. So if we look at ourselves against industry, we are in the middle of the pack in terms of how well we were doing. That was our base case. We were, approximately median, sort of level of performance. What we really aspire to be is top quartile. We want to be in the top quartile of performers around this in terms of cycle time. And so that's the goal for this pilot, is really, can we, through this and, and other strategies, achieve that broader outcome. I don't know that, that just by virtue of what we're doing with AI, it'll get us all the way there, but we think it's a material driver in all the underlying factors in terms of having a good starting point, having really good intelligence and understanding, your history with that particular site or in that particular country. All the building blocks that'll get us there. We think the AI has various use cases to enable that. I could speak to a few of the other ones that are surrounding that.
Just rounding up two more questions on this use case. One is, they say, AI is only as good as the data. How good is your data infrastructure of past contracts and structure to get that reconnaissance to make sure that you're doing that site engagement better?
Yeah, so this is one of the most surprising things. From my perspective, going in, our data was not good. This was an activity that we had, as a company, had delegated, transferred that responsibility to external partners. So we didn't have the ownership over the data, over the activity, to have good process analytics, to have good, very good analytics, right? We only had what we needed for oversight of that transfer of responsibility. And I was concerned with that. I'll be honest with you. I felt like that was going to be a real detriment to us. And what I learned through this was that the capabilities had advanced so far in terms of AI that just by virtue of having a lot of, this history of contracts, sometimes dead scans, sometimes just flat scans, paper, literally. The models we were working with, you were able to ingest that and still analyze that and use that. So what I thought was going to be a material weakness actually wasn't as a material of a weakness in terms of our data. Now, would I have liked to have more data, base cases around, how we negotiate and better cycle time? Sure, I think everybody would rather have that. But I was pleasantly surprised at how far the technology had come, that you could ingest all of that information and still get an analysis out of it, even though it's in PDFs and sometimes dead scan PDFs.
No, that's actually an amazing thing, that you actually thought the process was broken, but with the power of LLMs, it was getting better. The last question is, the change management effect, because people are not used to using AI or other things to collate this thing out. I like the way you segment in so that the users are using what they're used to. The contractors read the contracts, the budget guys read the deterministic piece. But outside of that, what kind of challenges did you face? Because this was not an easy adoption. People are going to trust somebody else's output to make their decision. So how did you work through that?
I think the first thing is we're still living and learning as we get further into it, and it's important, I think, to listen to people and understand and have that safe space where you can have that dialogue. The biggest part of the change management, frankly, was lack of experience with AI tools. There was not within our group, I think, in this space, there was not proficiency in some of the things. I mean, I myself, I'm not an expert yet at prompt engineering. It's one of the development areas I know I have for myself is just, getting better at that sort of thing. So the chain of management, I think, really comes around just basic core capabilities around AI fluency and the foundational elements of, if you're going to work with an agent, how do you prompt it? How do you ask it, questions in a way that gets you as fast as possible and as efficiently and as high quality responses as you want? Just those sorts of kind of core capabilities, I think, around prompt engineering. Um, I think the other thing that's probably a little bit of a cultural, but I think a very relevant consideration for organizations is, what does this mean? People want to know what things mean for themselves. So there's a concern, perhaps, that ultimately, eventually that the bots or the agents are just doing the negotiation and you don't need a negotiator, right? And we know that that's not the case, right? We know that the human elements, this AI enhances the human elements of some of these business processes as opposed to taking them or replacing them. So that I think there is some communication that has to happen there to reassure people, because in the popular media, you hear other things. You hear about layoffs. You hear about, software engineers, and some of the impacts that, of Amazon or some of the other software as a service, companies. You hear some of the impacts they've had. And I think that's a very relevant and human concern. So you just have to address that head on in your communication.
This is a fantastic use case. I don't think it's boring at all, Dennis. So it was a fascinating place of picking a process and then automating it out and then having some very clear ROIs and change management. So maybe we use the same motif for a couple of other use cases which you wanted to discuss.
So I'll speak to some of the other, kind of more basic ones that we're using right now. They're a little bit less, less flashy, just in my group. I mean, we often have to do a lot of research and a lot of exploratory analysis into what's changing in the environment, what's changing in the ecosystem, because my group, focusing on external partners, focusing on our clinical sites, we have a very outward looking view, and not everybody has that. And because I work in a sourcing group and we manage the contracts and the budgets both for sites and our external service provider partners, a lot of times, there's a reality check sometimes into how the cost of running a clinical trial has changed. So it becomes really important to keep abreast of what's happening in the ecosystem, both from a macroeconomic and a microeconomic sort of industry perspective. And that in and of itself could be an entire job. However, utilizing very basic tools, things like Copilot, we're able to ask the questions that we need to ask and get reputable site information with cited sources to then go in and be able to develop that and share that information back out with the organization. So to be able to tie what's happening in the external market to what some of our internal strategies are in terms of how we position, how the partners we work with, sometimes the choice of countries and sites we may go to, all kind of predicated upon some of the external intelligence. And we wouldn't be able to probably synthesize and summarize that information as effectively if it weren't for some of the technologies we were able to use today.
No, then that's a fascinating use case. Basically, you're doing almost equivalent to reg intelligence. This is much more market intelligence. You're doing, what's happening with sites, countries, tariffs, vendors you work with, and kind of collating information about them and then scoring the sentiment on is good things happening, bad things happening, trending, and then giving a summary report to your organization. Is that a very fair way to articulate what you're trying to do?
Yeah, it's very fair, Sri. I mean, it's, we work, and this is where, I mean, ICHU 6R3 and some of the relevant, regulatory guidance now is all about risk proportionality, right? And doing good risk management. And in order to do that, to your point around having market intelligence, you have to assess, the external market. You have to understand what's happening, what's a potential threat or opportunity. But we live in a very dynamic world, to say the least, right now. I mean, you called out a few of the things, right? So, supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tension, even natural disasters and climate change right now is a preeminent risk. And it's hard when you think about all the different risk and opportunity domains to keep abreast of all of those. And then to further to that, to really synthesize that information and think about, okay, when I look internally, is my organization, positioning appropriately? Is my sourcing strategy appropriate? Do I have any threats I need to mitigate? Those sorts of things. You know, technology has been a wonderful enabler for the teams to just be able to summarize some of that information and to go the step further and to now ask the AI a little bit about what they think the optimal strategy is, giving it some prompts around certain conditions or certain constraints, or we've had it becomes a thinking partner in a way, not to replace the humans, because it doesn't always have the answer, and there's some tacit subject matter expertise that you really have to apply in these situations, especially for our industry. But it becomes almost like a very rapid thinking partner that helps bring insight into the organization and then process some of that insight, into something you can use strategically. That to me has been, as a leader in the organization, has been a game changer. The fact that my teams are enabled with that capability now, and they can leverage that, and I can leverage that personally.
That is what's fascinating us. Isn't that what the future of work should be? Where before you would spend hours of time going through websites and stuff and distilling it. Right now, as you said, you're having a thinking partner. You have to give your thoughts around what should be valuable. Hey, climate change is valuable, but don't make it high risk. But supply chain disruption based on war is much more higher. I'm just making it up. But you're giving inputs to this thought partner, and you're evolving what should be that site engagement practice, and what should be your shipment and supply chain strategy and stuff like that, where you're now elevating yourself to asking those much more macro questions versus you would do 80% of the grunt work, and then you would have only 20% of the time for the macro. So you'd simplify it and say, I can't do all of this. It's too complicated. Let me go to the simple strategy. Right now, it's almost challenging you and your team to do more complex thinking. Is your team ready for such this thing? Because when you go from doing to thinking takes a lot of time and effort and experience. And then that's the part one. Part two is that synthesize of this data. Sometimes we call it AI slop. You start to rely on your thinking partner too much, that you're not thinking, and you're just being like, oh, AI must be right, and go about doing the job in its way. So two parts to it, because this is really where I think the world is going, where you're going to be having a thinking partner, and you're going to be thinking a lot about what to do. But it has two connects to it. One is you over trust it, or you under partner with it, right?
I want to talk about that second part first, Sri, because I think you hit upon a nerve there. I think that's a key thing, especially about how we think about how we shape our organizations and how we shape the next level of leaders. It's a real risk what you called out around the AI slop and around the reliance on it without applying critical thinking. I think that if I had to identify kind of what's the most existential risk with AI, I'd probably say it's that. I think there's a necessary discipline we have to instill in our people and in ourselves to not take that shortcut, to not just rely on it and not take it, in this world where everybody wants things faster and there's such a productivity crush. It is a very real risk that we fall into that. And I think we have to resist that. One of the things that I've observed, and I've observed this really recently in a presentation I'm developing myself now, and I'm using, Copilot's my partner in doing the research and thinking about things. And I'll tell you, I had that delightful experience of it made me think differently. It opened up ideas where then I applied that, that critical thinking and that, some thoughts. And the interesting thing is it actually can take longer. So I think people think about AI as something that's going to speed everything up. And in the use case we just described around developing strategy and synthesizing insight and external information into a strategy, I think it will make you take longer because it can give you the ability to think about more and different things that you may not have considered. Um, so it's almost that you have to kind of hold yourself accountable a bit to the discipline of saying, well, I'm not just going to take what it says and think about thing. I'm going to look at I'm going to open up those citations. I'm going to look at some of the primary research that's bringing into me some of that primary information. And I'm going to be deliberate about slowing down and thinking about what this means for me, as opposed to just copy pasting it right into, your PowerPoint deck or, or an email or whatever you're doing. Um, and that's something that I think, when we bring up our next levels of leaders and, in the workforce that sits within our organizations, that's a message that I think has to get through as well, is just not to think about it as an immediate gratification tool, but think about it, how it can level you up, in terms of your ability to think strategically and apply that human element that AI can't.
And actually, even though it physically takes more time, in the long term, it's going to save you time because you've thought through different scenarios. And so from a organizational productivity, it is much better. But as you said, in the short term, it's not like, okay, I did this 2 minutes later, I did that, cut and paste and put it together. And you need to apply critical thinking. Dennis, let me explore this because this is an area which is really fascinating for me, is how do you build that skill, right? Because we all go to college, we do tests and exams, then we come to the workforce and then we lose all of that and we just do work. We grunt in email, then we finish our email, we have meetings, we finish our meetings, we get to, and so that critical thinking activity is actually less and less in our day-to-day jobs. And so how do you, now that you've got to free yourself up, how do you bring yourself up to doing more of that, deep thinking? How do you build that skill set and an environment for that?
First of all, I think, some of it is hard to build. You almost have to, you have to have intrinsically, or you have to source for people in your organization that have sort of an intrinsic curiosity. I think that's something that can be hard necessarily to teach, but if there's a little spark of it there, you can nurture. So I think it starts with that curiosity, and a desire to learn, and to understand that the world is a dynamic, changing place. And, the more you kind of become inquisitive about it, the more you'll learn, and the more you learn, the more you can apply that as additional value to the thinking and the strategies that you put forward. Um, what I tend to do is I try to ask more questions. I try to ask, why? Why do we think that is? Why do you think that is? To kind of nurture that curiosity so that people can develop that skill of really exploration, and inquisitiveness and inquiry, critical inquiry. Why do we think that is? To get to the root cause of things, to then bring that to the table. It's hard because I think you're swimming upstream. I think everybody wants the answer. I think there is a push to get things quickly, and without a lot of effort sometimes. But I think slowing people down where it's appropriate. Hey, well, why do you think that is? Have you, let me understand your thinking. Challenge it, that they have to develop that thought process.
And that is, you hit upon a very key part, which I want to just highlight to everybody. They ask the question, why? In management, they say, the higher you go, the more whys you have to ask. And me personally, as a CEO, they say, have 5 whys before you give your opinion. So you ask the question exactly like, why is this happening? Okay, why did you make this decision? Why did you want to think that this is the right course of action? Why do you think this is going to benefit us? Why do you think, after the 5 whys is when you're supposed to give your opinion? And as you said that just resonated with me, that's a critical underpinning of where we need to build that critical thinking, is not to go with the answer, because the answer is not going to be easy and cheap and you take that on. It's that critical thinking of asking those whys. And maybe I'm going to use this, like, you guys can't use any Copilot answer without asking 5 whys. You can ask why, and you get to the root of it, but you also learn from it before you can start to make a decision, especially when it's a thought partner. I think there are different use cases where it's deterministic, like your previous use case, but this one where it's a thought partner, this is where AI slop can come in, because after some time, you're going to say, man, everything which it says is wildly wonderful. Why should I not trust it? And that's the first why. You should not trust it, and you should keep asking the whys. What do you think of that? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, and I'm 100% with you on the idea that as a leader in an organization, especially in your seat as a CEO, that you have to ask those questions because you want to understand your team's thinking. You want to see the depth in the thinking. So you're not challenging them because you're looking for the right answer. You're looking to understand the thought process that sits behind the decision. And I think that's a pivot for people to make. I and it's funny because it's a balance, right? It's to your point, slow down. You want to slow down and you want to be thoughtful on the thinking partner items and on the real strategic things. But then you want to use AI and some of these tools like Copilot and others when there is things that'll just help you speed up. So like I don't want to read. I'm sure you end up in the situation as well. Sometimes you get forwarded 15 emails in a chain because they want that they need to arbitrate something or they want a decision from you or your input. you know, you can use it to speed up by summarizing that. It's a very tactical use case, but it can summarize very eloquently what the key points of that those 15 emails are. And now you're fully up to speed and you can have an informed discussion with someone to help them, further whatever they need to move past. But um, in that case, it's a very fast, it's a speed up sort of situation, not necessarily a slowdown. So I think there's also a level, just getting back to your original question, I think there's also some upskilling in the organization and understanding where to apply which use case and where do you just go very quick and very tactical and where do you slow down and be very thoughtful and, be very cautious of the AI slop.
Why don't we pick one more kind of a critical use case? What's really exciting about this conversation is you're taking tangible areas and then deploying solutions to it. So is there any other area you would like to explore and talk through?
I'll talk about something that's more future focused, not something that that I could speak to the end game around, or that we're even in the middle of it now. But I'll tell you where I'm really interested in where AI and AI enabled tools are going to take us, and it's really around it's around risk. It's around just thinking about E6R3 and thinking about the emphasis on risk proportionate approaches, and understanding kind of where to apply rigor on what's critical to quality and what you can take a lighter approach to, or a less involved approach, because proportionally it's just not going to impact patient safety. It's not going to necessarily have the same impact on data integrity. I'm really excited to see what comes out of the market in terms of identification of risk, predictive risk indicators, AI being able to synthesize across multiple data sources and in more complex scenarios, and really, again, not making the deterministic decision around what it should be, but prompting as a thought partner to our risk managers, our central monitors, our CRAs, where, hey, you might want to look a little bit deeper here, or you may see there may be something here that you want to focus on, or, maybe just thinking about, systems like IRT or eCOA bills, just, hey, based on the complexity of this protocol, here's probably the areas where we really have to focus UAT, or we really need to think about how we design that system. Being that thought partner that can interpret lots of different disparate pieces of information and synthesize those and understand what that might mean, where there could be a risk, and where maybe that's been observed. And if you have the institutional assets, past experiences on trials, and being able to prompt people to say, think about this, apply your subject matter expertise, apply your knowledge, like look a little bit further at this. That can really help us direct our efforts in the right way that's in alignment with, I think, what the regulators expect of us and what we should be doing as a business in terms of risk proportionate approaches to quality.
That's a fascinating framework, right? Risk proportionate approaches to quality. The FDA has said that, there are a lot of regulators who say that, but we still are doing many things pedantically. I mean, from a testing standpoint, I know that for sure. We just apply, okay, this has to be tested and we do it, even though ICH says risk-based. Why are you testing things which you have already done before? As you said, how do you then look at complexity and then saying which areas are at most risk, dosing and patient endpoint collection, and let's focus more on that versus check if the roles and responsibilities screen is working very well for the 30th time, right? So but I think there were three parts to what you said. The first is risk identification, right? So almost you need a risk roster on what are risk parameters to play on, right? So that's just a risk catalog. The second part is risk assessment, which is what are my data sources to assess the risk. And then the third part, which you said, risk prediction, which is, okay, I've assessed this. I know my risk roster. These are high risk, low risk, and this is my prediction of what's going on. And in all of that, you need to be a thought partner. It's not like it going away and assessing and doing that, but you coming in play, which is very fascinating, which is you're almost converting a role from a doer to a risk assessor, and I never thought about that, but now every role will become something off of how do I assess the risk in doing this, believing the AI, furthering what I need to do, slowing down in critical thinking to make sure that we're getting to the right outcomes, right?
I would even add a fourth part to it, Sri. I would add, and this has been a paid point in the industry for a long time, you know, and that's really about, it's about knowledge management. And then it's about how do you treat that risk, once you've assessed it, where you've made the decision, this is something we need to respond to. We all do lessons learned meetings, right? We finish a trial, the teams get together, they do lessons learned, it goes in a spreadsheet or document, it goes somewhere, right? Somebody makes a PowerPoint. And then it's always a question of how do we make sure the teams that come after them actually benefit from those lessons learned? Well, if that becomes part of, the corpus of information you have within, that you can bounce off of your LLM or that you have within your enterprise AI architecture, you just think about teams when they encounter one of these risks and they have to respond to them. What if they were empowered with an agent that could then crawl all of the knowledge from the past lessons learned around this specific domain and be able to say, hey, these are some ideas. These are some things that work. These are some things that didn't work. Here's maybe the relative matching to the problem you're encountering or the design of the trial maybe you're working on. So maybe, you may be encouraged to look a little bit more closely at these solutions, but don't recreate the wheel. Don't recreate the wheel. Think about leverage the knowledge, elaborate on that knowledge of the teams that came before you. I mean, it's kind of fundamental because it differentiates us from a lot of other animals in the animal kingdom, right? Like humans are able to pass on knowledge from generation to generation and progressively build it. Whereas, other types of animals don't necessarily have that capability to do that. And so it is sort of a fundamental part of our evolution even to be able to do that. And that's maybe the evolution, I think, of AI in this specific use case, is even to take it to that fourth step. Not only is it helping predict and helping focus our energies, but perhaps it's even suggesting things that we've already built, solutions we've already developed that may be either appropriate or, be able to be elaborated on to be appropriate for new situations.
And then spot on, right? Everybody says the reason you learn history is because that teaches you a lot of lessons. And what you're saying is the same thing: organizational history and knowledge history. If you had that, you can learn a lot. This has been just a fascinating conversation, and we can go on for some time. What would be your final messages as you look forward in the next 12, 24 months? Where do you see this thing going? I mean, you talked about the impact on the workforce, but as somebody who's been in that transformational leadership, where do you see this going?
There's going to be a little bit of a reckoning. I think right now there's a lot of noise in the market. I think there's a lot of excitement, and I think that breeds a lot of, maybe a little bit of overselling kind of what it could do. I think where I see it going is a rationalization. I think there's going to be a reckoning that, while there are some tremendous and very exciting, and interesting use cases for AI, I think what we're going to find as an industry is the greatest opportunities lie in some of the more, the less exciting areas, the things that are repetitive, the things that are, higher volume that we can automate, and probably, the areas where traditionally as human beings, risk being one of them, we're just not wired, we're not built to be very good at, but AI kind of enhance our capabilities around. So I think there's in the future, there's going to be a little bit of a tailoring to as we become more fluent in this, understanding where the highest value use cases are, and maybe some of the things that, maybe are a little bit further off or a little bit next generation. But in the next 12 to 24 months, I think we're really going to be focusing on the value and the pragmatic value of where we can apply some of this technology. That's at least where I think the leading organizations are going to go, not necessarily for the moonshots, but stacking up those small W wins with AI to have big value in the end.
You're talking about the Moneyball concept. This is not going to be on giant home runs. It's going to come on singles, and you're going to make sure that you're going to have enough singles. And I think the next 12 months, just removing, mundane work and getting people to that critical thinking is going to be a real good journey. But I think we're going to hit a little bit of a plateau because some people will jump the S curve to the critical thinking. Some people may not. And so, to your point, how do you bring people who have to get up this S curve with that critical thinking knowledge is where it's very appropriate. You talked about everybody wanting to learn about prompts, but I think there's a whole thing around how do you go from being a doer to a thinker. And I think that's the journey which everybody has to go. But that is, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish we had more time and we could continue this for many, many more minutes and hours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sri. It's been a pleasure.
Sri, you talked about Dennis being pragmatic. What did you think of what he had to say?
I think it was a really fascinating discussion. And we talked about two use cases. One was really removing grunt work, which was really looking at documents and contracts and really extracting data and information to be prepared for site and site engagement. And there, Dennis brought a very thoughtful approach on how do you break a big problem into smaller chunks and then really deploy AI to solve those problems well. But the second one was a very interesting use case where he really used AI as a critical thinking partner. And we really explored how AI as a thinking partner not only challenges our own abilities, but how our ability to interact with AI.
You know, in that first use case, there were two things that really struck me. I think there's a tendency to think that you simply plug in AI, flip the switch, and it solves your problems. But you talked about the need to really shape the agentic process and think deeply about how you're employing it and what you needed to do. What did you think of that approach?
Where Dennis as a pragmatist comes in is to break the big problems into smaller chunks and then really to figure out what would be risk mitigated efforts to make sure that you're trying to solve for that. And so he broke a big problem into how do I first assess knowledge from cast contracts, to second part to how do I then distill that knowledge into a narrative to where I can engage with the sites, to third to really engaging and then really looking at cycle time improvement in contracting, but also in rework. So I think it was a very pragmatic way of thinking about this big problem and taking it into small chunks and making sure that you're bringing in the right scaffolding to ensure the success of those approaches.
The other part of that segmentation that I thought was so interesting was that the segmentation was done in a way that a lot of unstructured data went into one part of the process, whereas the structured data was in a separate part of the process. Does that help in other ways?
Yeah, I think it was actually the merging of these two together. So what he did was he knew that contracts and unstructured data, and he wanted to take structure components out of that contract. But that he was wanting to feed it was in study budgets, which are much more deterministic in nature. And therefore, the output of one of those was an input into the others to really making sure that you really looked at study budgets of the current, for the past, what you're trying to give for the sites, so that you can make sure that you're starting to drive it. So it was a very good way wherein where I think the future is going is you're bringing in more and more data from unstructured, which then can be structured through either summarization, sentiments, and others, and mix that with structured data, which are much more deterministic in nature. And bringing these two together really help you better make decisions and get to good results from an ROI standpoint.
Dennis has a very outward-facing role. He works with external partners and clinical trial sites. He talked about using AI as sort of a market intelligence tool. Is it unusual to see a company do this? Is something companies are doing broadly?
This is an area which actually companies are doing broadly, whether it's regulatory intelligence, market intelligence, looking at what's going on in the marketplace. With AI right now, we're having access to information, but more importantly, distilling that access to information into insights and value of either through summarizations or through critical inputs and feedback. So I think this is a use case which you're going to see more and more. And I call this use case knowledge democratization. And knowledge could be internal knowledge, which is stuck in documents, or external knowledge, which you're discerning from different bodies of work. But bringing both those things and democratizing that to make it more and more accessible to people is going to be a scale use case for AI.
You also talked about a coming reckoning with AI, that the greatest opportunities are in the more mundane, repetitive, and high volume areas. You agree?
I think so. I think in the next 12 months, we could put a lot of effort in removing grunt work and training ourselves in doing more critical work. And that would let us to be much more thought partners as AI starts to do more critical work. So I think it is a really good journey and a right way to progress forward.
Well, it was great to hear Dennis's insights today. Sri, thanks as always.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Agilisium Labs. Life Sciences DNA is a bi-monthly podcast produced by the Levine Media Group with production support from Fullview Media. Be sure to follow us on your preferred podcast platform. Music for this podcast is provided courtesy of the Jonah Levine Collective. We'd love to hear from you. Pop us a note at danny@levinemediagroup.com. For Life Sciences DNA, I'm Daniel Levine. Thanks for joining us.